Hi, my name is Eric Hynes. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image, and I welcome you to today's talk. This is a part of an ongoing series all month long. And just to give you a little sense of it, in case you didn't know beforehand, while the rise of streaming platforms has made the limited series a common format for screen storytelling, such an approach has been a staple of British television series for decades. On 4 successive Sundays from October to November, we invite MOBI members to join us as we explore a mix of recent and enduringly popular programs, all available to stream on the UK streaming service BritBox. Each of these selections exemplifies the art form of series-based storytelling. BritBox is generously offering this program to MOMI's members as a benefit in support of the museum and its programming. This episode is going to focus on the series A Confession. Now, A Confession, which premiered in the UK in 2019 and is available on BritBox, briefly, in 2011, after a night out with friends, 22-year-old Sian O'Callaghan disappeared. As Detective Steve Fulcher begins to piece together her last movements, he ties her disappearance to a local man who confesses his involvement in yet another woman's disappearance years earlier. A BritBox original, A Confession, chronicles the paths of 2 mothers living merely steps from one another, whose daughters had gone missing and whose lives were turned upside down by these events. And Fulcher, whose career and marriage are imperiled when he faces expulsion from the force for coercing the man's confession and eliciting divergent and controversial court rulings. Now, it's normally not the case when you read a description of a series that way that you are going to then introduce the person who's named in that description, but we get to spend some time with Stephen Fulcher. Stephen Fulcher is a highly experienced investigator, criminologist, author, and changemaker with a passion for pursuing justice. Having served in the 3 UK police forces and in national law enforcement agencies, he has led over 50 major crime cases, many being time-critical, high-risk, and high-profile. Fulcher is famously known for serving as the detective superintendent for the Wiltshire Police, where he investigated the disappearance and murder of 2 young females. He has since published a book with Penguin Random House UK, Catching a Serial Killer, and worked with ITV as a police content and production consultant to create the 6-part drama, A Confession. And also writer Jeff Pope. Jeff Pope is an award-winning writer for film and television. Film credits include Philomena, for which Jeff picked up an Academy Award, Golden Globe, BIFA, and London Critics Circle nominations, and BAFTA and Venice Film Festival wins for Best Adapted Screenplay. TV work includes the BAFTA-winning ITV drama Mrs. Biggs, the multi-award-winning Dirty Filthy Love, BAFTA winner Scylla and Lucan. As a producer and writer-producer, Jeff has helmed a number of award-winning dramas, including the BAFTA-winning See No Evil, The Moors Murders, Appropriate Adult, which earned the 5 BAFTA awards, as well as a Golden Globe nomination, and most recently, BAFTA-nominated A Confession, and during lockdown, Isolation Stories. And finally, director Paul Andrew Williams. Paul is an acclaimed writer and BAFTA-winning director. His body of work to date includes the theatrical release of 4 feature films and primetime television programming for the BBC and ITV. Paul's films include the critically acclaimed London to Brighton horror comedy The Cottage, home invasion thriller Cherry Tree Lane, and Song from Marion, which closed the Toronto Film Festival. In 2014, Paul directed Murdered by My Boyfriend for the BBC, which won the RTS Award for Single Drama, followed by the critically acclaimed The Eichmann Show. And in 2016, he was the lead director of BAFTA-winning drama series Broadchurch, as well as directing the BAFTA-winning Murdered for Being Different for BBC Studios. Most recently, he directed A Confession, as well as Isolation Stories, a miniseries depicting life in Britain during lockdown, both for ITV and BritBox. And now, still during lockdown, I want to thank our guests for being here today to talk about A Confession. I just want to note, Paul in particular, thank you for being here. This is your birthday, as I discovered just before we started. So,
no problem. I would always mention it on the off chance that someone will be nearby with gifts.
Well, I think Jeff and Stephen are nowhere near one another, so I don't think that can happen quite at the moment.
No, either do I.
I think we'll start with Stephen, I think, because that's where the story begins, Stephen, if you don't mind. And the thing that I would love to spend a little bit of time sketching out, not too overtly or deliberately or tediously, but I think because of the pathway of the creation of work and storytelling, the way that a story can be adapted several times before it makes its way to an audience, that there's the experience itself that gets adapted to the text that you wrote, that then gets adapted to your work with Jeff and then that what Jeff wrote and prepared gets adapted visually and in an audiovisual sense by Paul later on. And so there's stages here, but then there's also collaborations along the way. And that's, I think, some of the stuff that an audience doesn't necessarily know, and I think changes from story to story. So Stephen, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about the decision to take your experiences and put them into prose form, to tell them as a story, and how your understanding of them as a story, if you experienced it as story, or when it came the writing part for it when it became something that, if you lived it as story, or whether it became story when you wrote it.
Well, I wrote it as a catharsis because for at least 2 years I never slept. This case was so traumatic to me personally, but also obviously the nature of the case was constantly going around in my mind. So in 2014, I wrote it down actually with Deb Peach, who was my PA on the case, and thought no more of it. I thought that's where it would end. Of course, events continued into 2016 when we had the second court case, and in some ways sort of reversed, well, it obviously reversed the original High Court decision, which caused the end of my career. So it was, I never expected it to be made into, or to be published, or to be made into a film, a drama in this case. It was just purely to get it out of my head and get it on paper. And when there was some interest in it, it had a hugely beneficial effect of actually being able to put this issue into the public domain. There's a critically important issue in this case, and that issue is whether a victim's right to life is subordinate to a suspect's right to silence. That's the key issue. And my personal view is that the law has moved so far away from the notion of pursuing justice and truth that it was an important public interest issue. That and the fact that there are clearly other victims other than the two that we finally prosecuted Christopher Halliwell for. So the writing was purely a personal thing. Once it was picked up by Penguin, it was obviously professionalized, and then actually the writing process, I suppose, went through past the court case at the tail end of 2016, and it became the book that it was. Again, I never expected it to be picked up. The fact that Jeff actually went to a huge amount of trouble to try and find me, because A, I'm not on social media, and B, I kept moving house. And the fact that Jeff found me and was so passionate about it was one of the striking issues about this case.
If you don't mind, I wanted to follow up on you talked about how you sat down to write it, I forget the word you used, to process it, or to after years of being haunted by it, started writing it. But I'm curious about the form that writing took, about, all the things that you're describing. You could be expressing that in various ways, and you are expressing it in various ways. And I'm interested in the way that you chose to approach that. Did you do it in a chronological sense? Were you doing it in a sort of evidentiary sense, going through moment by moment to try to piece together what had happened? How did you approach that?
Well, I was quite fortunate because the police tried to prosecute me and they put me through a discipline process. Part of the consequence of that is I had full disclosure. So I have, and Jeff's probably still got them, boxes of primary evidence, i.e. the original court transcripts. I mean, they're fascinating in their own right. But I approached it in a chronological sense. But we wrote it was written in about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 5,000 words a day. Deb and I, we didn't meet. We did it over Skype, and we'd sit down and say we won't finish until we've done 5,000 words. A lot of it's from primary source material. So that's the original iteration. And it was just purely about trying to piece this incredibly strange set of circumstances. When the public listens to this, they think, well, how on earth can this happen? What was it that I had done that was worthy of such a program? Having adopted that approach, of course, we ended up with a product of considerably more than a publisher would want to publish. And of course, the story wasn't finished because this was in 2014. But because I was in Somalia and obviously doing other things and trying to put this issue behind me, but it then reared its head again rather fortuitously in a second court case, and that's why it's so dramatic. I mean, some of the aspects of this case are you couldn't make up. They're so almost surreal. Being cross-examined in Crown Court by Christopher Halliwell, for instance, is quite a surreal experience. It doesn't happen very often that an unrepresented individual would try to defend himself against a murder charge for which there is overwhelming evidence.
Yeah.
But the way that is woven into a drama, I mean, I'm just obviously very grateful that Jeff picked it up. But you couldn't make this story up in as much as it sounds. If you try to create it as a bit of fiction, people would have said, don't be ridiculous. It just simply can't happen that way. It's not the way the law works. But so in some ways, it was hugely beneficial for me from a psychological point of view, just getting out of my head, because I was in a position in which I was thinking, how on earth did this happen? And how am I supposed to respond to it? Just as an aside, as Jeff and Paul both know, the Deputy Chief Constable of the police force committed suicide right in the very heat of battle in the middle of this case. And that's the kind of pressure that I was obviously subjected to.
Wow. And you also said, Stephen, you mentioned that Jeff was pursued you. Like Jeff, you wanted to work on this story. You pursued Stephen to do so.
Yes, I'd come across it being reported in national newspapers, and it would have been at the time of the original trial when the confession, in inverted commas, of Halliwell to the murder of the second girl, which was chronologically before Sian O'Callaghan, was thrown out of court because of the question marks over the legitimacy of that confession. So what I read was man confesses to murder, takes police officer to the location of the body, but a court is ordered to find him not guilty of that murder. It was that kind of that's how it gets filtered down. So I just thought, that what on earth has happened there, just as Steve has said. So I resolved to try and contact Steve, but it took a long time, because what I didn't realise was that he had, when I first met, I've said this, I'm not betraying confidence here. When I met Steve, I realised after weeks of working very closely with him, going over and over the story, that he was incredibly burned by what had happened. He was, I would even go as far as to say, if you forgive me, Steve, that it was some version of PTSD. It had that much trauma, the effect on his life. And so what was happening was that I hadn't realized that he had been, he'd lost his job, he'd been hounded out of the police, pilloried, unable to find employment in this country again. And had gone abroad to seek work, and I couldn't find him. I wrote to the force, the Wiltshire police, and asked if they could forward the letter. Let's just say it didn't get forwarded, and so I couldn't find him. And it was a long time before Steve had gone away and got some semblance of equilibrium back in his life. Wrote the book, and the book was then on the verge of being published. That it was almost like an out-of-body experience, as Stephen Fulcher has written a book about what happened. So then finally we got together.
Mm. And did you have a sense of what you might want to do with it, or what you thought it might become, or what shape it could take? I mean, one of the things that I find interesting, and just in terms of like how we are coming to it from the museum to being fascinated with this as a particular story, is the fact that there's no one size fits all sense to this has to fit into a certain box. And you would imagine, it seems that the story itself dictates the shape that it's taking.
Well, what I knew going into the meeting with Steve was that it was, for the first part, a thriller, which was, the girl is missing, where is she? Can we find her? Can we save her life? Which was Steve's first priority. But I knew it became something else. It was, you know, so the thriller then morphs into something else, which was this incredibly, on the one hand, very simple, but incredibly complicated part of the story where they find the body of the first girl, he admits to a second girl, and yet that confession is ruled out. And so you have this bizarre situation where there are lawyers and police officers in court arguing about whether or not someone is allowed to confess. And because it wasn't, I mean, obviously I understand if there's a scenario when there's a police officer and a suspect, and they're locked together in a cell in a police station, and, you know, the police officer emerges with a confession, but there's no other evidence, that's suspect. You know, I get that. And I understand that there's the law in the UK is PACE, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which was
1984.
84. Oh God, it was a long time ago. So that's what that law was brought in to stop from happening. But it was in full gaze of dozens of police officers, helicopters, police cars, and it was unbidden. Steve had no idea that Halliwell was going to say, "There's another one." So, and there was a contemporary note of the confession made. So I knew it became something else, and I knew that it affected Steve's life, his personal life, his professional life. And so I started from that. I started from long conversations with Steve, going over and over and over. And interestingly, he talked about a theme there. He said it was almost like a cry of a person, no one's listening. If anyone else could tell me what I should have done, then please tell me. And almost exactly that line was in the drama. Steve's very articulate as well. There was a line as well, which was almost the last line, when he confided to me that he realized at the end, I think it gave him some sense of perspective on what had happened, which was that he realized that it was on that day when the confession was made, there was, without either of them really realizing it, there was some kind of pact that they made, that they would bring each other down and that they would end each other. Halliwell would tell Steve what he'd done, but in receiving that information, Steve would lose everything too. So I started from that core of Steve, and many sessions of going over and over and over. And as he said, I then worked outwards from that and spoke to others to try and verify, looked at court records, all that. And then I also knew the other element was the two mothers of the two victims. And where the drama really, that part of the drama really took off, was that they coped with grief in very, very different ways. So it made for a very rounded piece. You couldn't really pin it down. I just knew that it was a story that you certainly could not predict the ending of the story from the first scene.
And each episode leads with a title card saying that this is a true story and that there's copious research that goes into constructing that. How did that help create what you were working on, and did that ever feel like a hindrance as a storyteller? Did you ever feel frustrated by being limited by that, or was that always something that was beneficial to what you were creating?
No, that's really, that's a, what's the word I'm looking for? That's a contract with your audience. You're being honest. You're saying exactly what this is. My process, and it was, you know, picked up brilliantly by Paul and the cast, was to not. I always describe it thus: it's about going deeper and deeper and deeper into the truth and events, rather than a process by which you, as it were, pull back and knock the rough edges off it and create something that's would follow normal, in inverted commas, drama rules. So, and why that appeals to me is I think by going deeper and deeper into the actual events, the DNA of this story, by definition, you're going to find something that's utterly non-cliched. So that's what my process is. No, quite the reverse. I feel completely liberated by going deeper and deeper and deeper in, because in there you find things that, to echo what Steve said in his remarks, is you find something you couldn't possibly create, and you couldn't imagine, you couldn't dream up.
And Paul, would you mind sort of following that thread with me a little bit in terms of taking on then what's on the page and bringing it to life with that kind of North Star of having the truth be what's guiding you? But of course there needs to be some room for you to make creative choices on your own.
I mean, yeah, of course. But the thing is the whole thing about this project was that the life was already there. Do you know what I mean? In terms of telling a true story, especially one as dramatic as this, is you don't really have to do anything apart from tell the truth. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think that as long as you've got good people, good actors who sort of know what they're doing, then the story is interesting and engaging enough that the performances, and even from Jeff's writing as well, there's no need to embellish anything, because what interests me, certainly as a director and as a viewer, is seeing normal people deal with extraordinary things, and which is obviously what everyone in this story does. And I think it's all there in Steve's story, and it's all there since that in Jeff's script, and then therefore it should just all be there, when you're doing it. So it's just a case of, this is the scene, let's capture it. So creatively it was like, all I want to do is make sure that we see this, or we feel a part of this story, and then we'll be involved.
I'm going to take this moment to Leah. We're just going to show that first clip, which is from the first episode, just to sort of give the audience a little grounding.
Steve Fulcher.
Boss, I hope you don't mind me calling. You said any time.
Yeah, but not at night.
Oh, sorry.
I'm taking the piss. What have you got?
We've done the run from Old Town out of Savanack Forest. Average journey time's 25 minutes.
Okay, so she gets to Savanack at 3:24. It means she left at Old Town at, say, 3. We know she left Suju's at 2:52, which gives us 8 minutes. Unaccounted for. Whatever happened between her leaving the club and just her phone? Leaving for the ride to Savanack Forest happened in those 8 minutes, right?
Narrows it down a bit, sir.
Yes, it does. Well done, thank you.
Of course, is Martin Freeman and Steve Fulcher. Paul, what are you reacting to?
Just well, it's just 2 shots in it. One guy's in bed and one guy's on the phone. It's just an interesting, obviously it's an important moment in the script, but it's just like, we're about to show you a clip of this series, and I'm like, the car's jumping over and the flames coming out, and you've got 2 people talking on the phone. But and that's, in a way, that sums up.
A little bit careful, I think, because of information.
No, of course, but I think that's what summed up the show. I think in so ways that this is what people do. That's how it happened, isn't it? You got one guy who's ringing him up, going, "Listen, this is what I've just found out," and then you got Martin processing it and working out, okay, well, what you do next. So it's just interesting because the show, it's one of the most favorite things I've done, and how often do you get a chance to just show what it is, show what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that's Paul, having worked in television in various ways, as well as in theatrical film directing, sometimes you are directing in a single episode in a larger series, and sometimes you are directing an entire series. And interesting. You and this basically you're the director for all 6 for the full cycle here. And I'm curious about what that offers you, what that allows you that maybe in a different context you wouldn't be able to.
Well, I think you get to see it through, don't you? I mean, the thing is obviously, it goes from being, if you like, Stephen's baby to Jeff's baby to my baby, and so it's all our individual babies, if you like, because you invest an awful amount of stuff into it, and in a way, I want to see it from birth to end, and I don't want to see it from birth to stage 2, and then someone else comes in and looks after it for ages. That for me is not fun, and it's not the reason why you sign up for something. You don't sign up for something that you care about to, kick it off. Unlike you sign up for something because you want to tell that story, and that you want to tell the whole story, not just a little bit of it. Mm-hmm. And that's really important to me. Mm-hmm.
So I was just going to say, sorry, Paul, just to help, because it's directly relevant. I always felt, I wasn't certain when I started to write that it would be 6 episodes.
Yeah.
It became clear that it needed that long in order for the story to be told. But I always knew if it had been 3 episodes, or even when it became 6, that it needed one director. It needed to be a whole. Whether it was divided into 4 or 6, it needed a filmmaker who was going to take on the piece as a whole. And it allowed Paul to, I won't speak for him, but it allowed Paul to, even obviously with performances, but even visually allowed him to plot how the piece progressed. I'm talking particularly, I won't say it for you, Paul, but particularly how your decision that the first episodes, the feel of the piece was more fractured. Everyone was looking for an answer on screen. They didn't know what this meant or what that meant. And as gradually the series went on, it became more controlled. And it was just such a clear. I'm not a frustrated director. I love working with talented directors because they see things in the way I can't. And I thought, wow, that's clever. The idea that just subconsciously, the thing is just from the look of it, whatever anyone's saying in the scene, visually the thing is telling the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that because it was a lot of people would originally on the first, the camera's moves around a lot, and they definitely stopped talking about it very soon, and that probably because the camera stopped moving around as much, if you like. The bottom line is, as a director, you just want to always, you want to read something that makes you go, well, it's already here. Do you know what I mean? Confident, I hate to say it, confident writing, where there's no exposition. You trust in the fact that the audience is going to understand it. Mm-hmm. And also it's the case itself. It's frustrating. Obviously the small fraction of frustration that we all felt at what was going on compared with the mammoth amount of frustration that Stephen obviously felt.
Stephen, what was your involvement once things made their way into becoming a series? Were you in conversation with Jeff during his writing? Were you in conversation with Paul? I'm curious about how you were threaded through the experience of making A Confession.
Yeah, I met Martin and spent some time with Martin Freeman, who all my friends and family say he was uncanny in his ability to capture my mannerisms, which the whole acting profession is an art form that I hold in much higher regard than I perhaps realised prior to getting engaged in this exercise. And Martin was in contact with me. I was in Somalia. Obviously, I'd spent a lot of time prior to Jeff writing the script with Jeff, and then when I was in Somalia, we'd have long phone conversations. I'm 5 hours ahead of him. I don't think he ever realised that I was picking the calls up at 1 a.m. or whatever. But he was so engaged with the process that, of course, that kind of interaction was, and feeling that I was part of a direct input into the end product was, for me, very, very important, because I certainly never felt that I'd lost connection with the storytelling. And I could see when I had a pre-read of the scripts before they were filmed. I was on set on occasion. My wife and children actually tried to trot up as much as they could, and Paul and everybody made them hugely welcome. I think the casting was really important because not just Martin, but all of the cast, but some big names, which obviously gave it a much bigger audience, an international audience, was critically important for my objective, which is to get this into the public domain. And their ability to, I think Martin had said, as a sort of lead actor to the rest of the cast, we're not going to do any acting. We're going to be portraying this as is. So everything that Paul said illustrates the point that this is a straight storytelling, consistent through from me writing the book in the first place, Jeff writing the script and producing, and Paul directing. Everything was really a very straight performance. It wasn't. There was no sort of ego-centric portrayal of any of these extraordinary.
I mean, what would you add to it? What would you add to make it more exciting? Do you know, or more, I say excited, and that's not necessarily the right word, but what would you add to make it more dramatic?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
You could,
yeah.
No,
But did you take things out as a result because it was so dramatic?
There were certain things.
I think Paul's right. It's like it was there. It was for me as well. It was a gift. You know, it was every time in corralling the narrative. Every time you instinctively felt you wanted to go somewhere, there was a wealth of material to go there. You know, it was, and I think it was exactly the right decision that kind of tumbled down from Paul, which is, you know, a no acting job. Yeah, you know what we mean by that. Image means that of course they were acting, but there was nothing, as you know. Steve summed it up perfectly. There was nothing showy.
No, I think that's really, that's really important. I think you don't need that.
There were certain things. British law constraints from my publishing. Obviously, I've discussed them with Jeff and Paul. There is a certain residual frustration that certain aspects could never be published or portrayed. So, even at the end, when we've had a thorough examination of a set of circumstances, there's still aspects that the law prohibits the public from knowing. That's just one little regret on my part, but there's no way around that.
Sure, I can imagine.
And the thing is, there's always things, including, there are things put in place to protect certain things, but it's often, it does more damage because it sort of prevents reality hitting, I think.
There was a thing there was, again, I was thinking about it. There's a moment when Halliwell's confessed to Steve in front of a lot of police officers, and full view of his secretary is making a contemporaneous note. He's then brought back to the police station, given access to a solicitor, which is his right. First thing he says after that meeting with the solicitor is no comment, which again is his right. And then there's a moment in court. It was a voir dire, which is a pre-hearing, and there was a judge. There was some of the most eminent barristers in the country involved. And it was a very intense, many days of discussion and argument. And if you stood back and looked, if a Martian looked at it, all these people were trying to argue that black was white. It was mad. It was, he's made the confession. And yet there was the most detailed, agonized argument as to, no, he didn't make the confession. It was, never left me. It's never left me since I properly came across it and realized there's something wrong when a system, when that happens.
But there are two diametrically opposed High Court judgments in this case. So High Court judges sitting have arrived at two diametrically opposed judgments on the same set of circumstances. My point is that the first judge got it wrong. The admissibility test is whether the probative value is outweighed by the prejudicial effect. So if you tortured somebody, obviously that might very well outweigh the value. But the circumstances of this case, a confession freely given, supported by a body and an account of how that body came to be in a shallow grave, was ruled inadmissible on the notion of a subjective view of oppression, which simply isn't true in this case. So 2 years and obviously a lot of pain. A High Court judge examining the same circumstances reverses the original judgment, which in British courts, of course, is unheard of because we're very precious. We still wear the wigs and the gowns and the silk underwear in the judiciary, and they're very reluctant to reverse or to be seen to reverse former decisions. But
I mean, it is the whole thing is insanity, and infuriating.
And I did think again after the first pre-hearing, the one which decided that they weren't going to allow the confession. This is a man who's killed 2 women, who will, as a result of the fact that no evidence will be heard in the second murder, will be given a finish date to his incarceration. It will still be a lengthy prison term, but there will be a point in his 60s when he will be released from prison, when he's a multiple murderer, at least 2, many, probably more. Everyone in that court knew that. And I did wonder and again, I'm trying not to be too accusatory, but you do wonder that those straining everything to have the second confession discounted. When the judge said, "I am not going to allow the evidence for the second confession," you do wonder what was their feeling. Did they feel, it was, that's a good day's work? Or because all I could think of was there's a really seriously deranged, dangerous man potentially going to be back amongst us in 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and you draw it out in the series, but the really interesting point and the opportunity that was lost as a consequence of that decision was the ability to investigate the other victims of his criminality. We know there were 60 items of women's clothing, a shotgun, and so 2 of those items in the trophy store are attributable to the 2 victims we've identified. So you don't have to be the world's greatest detective to consider it highly probable that there are other victims, and whether they ever come to light now as a consequence of what happened in this case is the real tragedy, or another tragedy to lay on top of the others.
Yeah.
One thing I'm hearing the way that you're all talking about it, and particularly Jeff, in terms of, or to all 3 of you, and the disbelief that this could be the outcome, but to me it reflects well on exactly why you approached the story the way that you did, to go this far into detail and to also sort of let the process play out. Because as a result, I mean, and as a viewer, I'm invited into a process where, though the outcome might be immoral and unthinkable and dangerous, you can actually see how it happens. You can see how getting caught up in the legality, caught up in the processes that are required to do your work, Stephen, could also entrap you, or could also sort of work against you rather than for the work that you're trying to do. And I think that if you were to just sort of tell folks without showing that process, it would seem unthinkable. And yet you actually show how it's quite thinkable and how it's actually quite possible.
It is, because...
Sorry, Steve, I'll let you hand over to you, but dramatizing it was the key. Exactly as you've said, Eric, that it's about the subtlety and the nuance. A drama allows that all to come out. I couldn't put myself into the piece. I had to be as dispassionate as I could be. But as opposed to a documentary, which would be more of a bald statement of the facts. The drama, and so the emotional impact of what's happening, allows us to understand it in much greater detail.
I was just going to make the point that in terms of crime investigation, I sound like I'm self-congratulatory, but it was one of the most brilliant investigations you could envisage. And the tragedy for me, I had a whole team of people who they wouldn't go home. They were so dedicated in trying to find Sian. The reason this is such a rare case is because very few detectives get onto a case so quickly, such that they have a realistic chance of saving somebody's life in an abduction case. Normally, you'll find the case being left until you find a dead body, or the noise from the public becomes so great that the police have to act. But 30 years since the enactment of PACE, for this issue not to have been front and centre illustrates, in my view, that the police service isn't necessarily providing the quality of investigation it should do. As I say, from my perspective, the dedication of the people working with me on this were their sort of praise and recognition was lost as a consequence of me being castigated and put through the mill. And at no point were we able to sort of stand back and look at what we achieved and take professional comfort in it, or pride in what was a really quite extraordinary investigation. It's almost impossible to, with a very, very difficult cases, when you have a nobody murder, they're almost totally impossible when you've got a crime in action and you don't even know what's happened. So the circumstances of this case, from a detective's point of view, are extraordinary. But and I think that's drawn out in the series, that people can see that the moment by moment pressure of trying to work out where you have no clear picture, you haven't got a body, you haven't got somebody to work back from, you've got no forensic opportunities, trying purely to piece together a crime as it's occurring, I suppose. It's drawn out in the series, and that's why the way Paul portrays it is so useful, almost like as if he's on my shoulder and watching the action as the viewer can participate in the difficult, problematic decisions that had to be made moment by moment. It was literally a period of time with no rest in between. There wasn't a moment at which you could say, well, I can leave it for 8 hours for some sleep because she'll be fine. It's a race against time to save somebody's life.
Let's show that second clip there, which I think speaks to exactly what Stephen's talking about in terms of that team coming together.
Right. Halliwell has got some previous convictions, mostly low level. Last one back in '86 for burglary. String of aliases, no history of violence or sex offences.
Now, works for 5 Star Cabs, a local company who say his last pickup for them was at 1:10 on Saturday morning. Now, from 5 Star's tracking system, we see he loops round and round the city centre, and at 2:14, at the junction of Newport Street and Tismead Crescent, he turns his GPS off. Now, at this point, he's about half a mile from Old Town High Street.
Well, we have checked out the home address. The car is on the drive, but the surveillance team have said it's going to be very, very difficult to put a lump on it without setting off an alarm. So it could be that we're going to have to do a full surveillance old style.
Well, yeah, we could pull him now for sure and maybe recover some evidence from his car or his clothes, his house. But I've said from the beginning that I want us to work on the assumption that this is an abduction and that Sian is alive somewhere. So we keep him in play.
Do you really think she still is, boss?
I don't know. But the moment that we arrest him, his brief will advise him to go no comment, and if Sian is out there somewhere, then we will never find her, and she will die.
Okay. So, we follow him and hope he leads us to her. Right?
We're her only chance.
Good, man. I love it. Good, isn't it?
More than one shot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. I'm dead proud of it.
It is a really good bit of work, actually. I always found it difficult watching it because it's taken me a while to want to do so. But I'll probably sit down and watch the whole 6 episodes when I get back to the UK, because it is a superb drama, actually.
And that was incredible. If for those who haven't seen it, just even that scene, a collection of extraordinary actors. And I think that you talked about in terms of telling the truth and it being somewhat straightforward. I think it's not so straightforward to bring in actors who are able to do that work and bring to the story what they have. One of the things that I think really is so meaningful to the entire series is how glances and reaction shots, how important they are throughout, at both as a sort of, in a sense of foreshadowing what might become issues. Whenever there is a potentially sticky legal procedural moment, there tends to be a subtle absorption on the part of a character, just to sort of clue you in that this is not as straightforward as you might think, or that they know that there's a complicating factor here. And I think that's and the character of Stephen is doing that throughout. There's never a sense that the audience feels that they've got something over on any of these incredibly talented and impassioned folks. They know every step of the way that there are landmines along the way, and they still have to make their way through through those mines to make their way to doing their job.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, you know, I love watching all the, you know, the police documentaries, you know, where they follow a case and you watch people in the incident room, and I'm fascinated by it. And then there's never any drama in that. I know what's going on.
It's true that there are, it was complex legally, what we could and couldn't say. And I think I do, not so sure, Paul, but I always underestimate what an audience will pick up. And in fact, they did pick up such a lot from, as you say, looks. And that is really, really important. And it, you know, it's always a message to myself, which is trust the audience. And secondly, Steve had an ability to convey exactly what was going on at any point in the inquiry. Now, there were incredibly hundreds of pieces of information coming in all the time from all different directions. But like in the scene there when Steve's character, you know, he made that decision very, very clearly, very early on. It's a crime in action. We proceed on the basis that she's still alive. And he, you know, so when in my sessions with him, he just was able to, in a way that I understood, he could explain very clearly what was happening. So it was a filter down. It started with just a very incredibly strong grasp. Even after what he'd been through, he was just saying, no, this is what happened, then this, and it was for this reason, and so on. So I never felt lost trying to work my way through and adapt.
And Stephen, is there something about that particular moment? You said that Jeff said that you held on to what your rationale was and what you were thinking. Like, is there something about revisiting that moment when there was still a possibility that you could save her life? That is that in particular something that haunts you? Because that's, as you said, it's a rare space to be in that line of work.
Yeah, I mean, there's the advantage that everything had been written down at the time in terms of policy, and with a. But Jeff's right. There's a colossal amount of simultaneous information coming in, and you have to process it and see through the spurious to keep focused on the critically important issue. It did haunt me. It haunted me for a long, long time. I replayed those events over and over and over for 2 years or more until I wrote the book, because I was trying to work out, well, you know, how can something that appears so good be considered so in such a negative light? What else could I or should I have done? I've asked that question for thousands of times from hundreds of different people. I'm in a different place now. I mean, obviously, time has passed, And I don't look back on that with any sort of regret, because I had to act in that fashion, in that sequence. And take some comfort in the notion that I brought two girls back to their mothers. And when you look at the really interesting part of the story is Karen Edwards, the mother of Becky. Having known her particularly well over the last several years, you know, the effect on a mother of a child that's been missing for 8 years. People don't forget, mothers don't forget they had a daughter and haven't seen them for 8 years, the devastating psychological effect. So Jeff's absolutely right, but I take some comfort, regardless of all the pain that we went through, that some good has come out of it, albeit we couldn't save Sian's life. But by acting in that way, swiftly, on the assumption that you could save Sian's life, we know that we acted professionally, properly, and in the best interests of the victims of crime. So what more can you ask of a police officer in his sense of duty?
But you caught him as well. You caught him.
Yes.
You caught him without maybe that whole thing. Maybe
if you look back on those circumstances and we'd taken a different route, I'd now probably be in a worse psychological condition, wondering where's Sian and what else could I or should I have done to have found her. In the same way that high-profile missing people like Susie Lamplugh plague the SIO to their dying day. You know, you don't forget that you had a duty and you failed to execute it. So I suppose on that basis, it's worth the pain. I suppose the result I'd really like is that the efforts of Jeff and Paul and ITV to drive this drama, and we pushed very hard through ministerial processes to try to get the government to understand this issue and affect change. That hasn't happened yet, but the more audience we get and the more people that understand the issue, who knows?
We are about at our hour mark, but I wanted to if I quickly, if you don't mind my asking, I'm curious about location, and if you shot the film anywhere where these events took place or not, or I'm just interested in how you map this out in an environmental sense based on where it all took place. I guess it's just for Paul.
Oh no, we shot the hill where the confession actually took place. We shot there, and we shot in the same sort of geographical area of where the bodies were found. But obviously, you want to be careful to. It's not a documentary. You don't want to sort of, you don't need to show that field as being that's the field. My whole thing is a field looks like a field as long as it's. But yeah, no, I think geographically it's always best to, unless it's absolutely essential, to sort of honour the people involved and not sort of do anything that's disrespectful.
But one of the surreal aspects of the case was the confession was actually made just off the tail of the Iron Age White Horse. It's one of the most famous British landmarks. If you were writing a fictional drama, you might cheesily put that in, but it actually happened right there. And then sort of graphically as a filmmaker, I suppose for Paul, it was a bit of a gift, if not a bit cheesy, perhaps.
Well, no, the only downside of it is you can only see it's a horse if you're filming from miles up. Otherwise, it just looks like a hill.
Yeah.
And then came drones and helicopters, but it was pretty stunning, the sequence.
Yeah, I mean, look, the field was
where it really happened.
But it's I mean, I think that for me, it's always, yes, the scenery and the locations are always important, but it was what's on the bench. That's the key. What was said when they were sat down. I think it's a really important. I think it's a very important piece show. And
on that bench, Eric, there's I don't think. Well, I can cut it out if it's a spoiler. But that's the turning point of the whole series. Is Stephen's got the confession to the murder of Sian, the girl who's gone missing. Halliwell says, I want to tell you something. And he thinks he's going to unburden about the murder of Sian, and then just at some point, unbidden, says, do you want another one? And that's when everyone's life changed.
And as storytelling, I have to say, like, that's those who might be tuning in because they like the genre of true crime, say, that's the moment you realize that what you think this is building up to isn't quite what it's building up to, you know? And it's not just, here's a case and this is going to be bracketed in such a way. And if you're aware that this is a 6-episode cycle, that there's a lot of story left to go, even though you've supposedly maybe arrived at the thing that's often the last scene of the film. That's really interesting in a storytelling sense, but also very, very meaningful for what this actually is about and where it's going.
Yeah.
There's one aspect of this being Stephen's story, and yet from the beginning it's established that there are perspectives that Stephen wasn't necessarily present for, and there are lives that we get the chance to trace over the course of this that are separate from his own experience, and in particular the two mothers, which become like a real structurally important aspect of the story, but then also in so many ways the heart of where things get to. Jeff, do you want to speak at all about that?
Yeah, this process I was talking about, which was to go into the story, constantly looking for the DNA, the little detail. What I realised, which was so extraordinary, is that even though the murders were, I think it's 8 years apart, Steve, was it?
Yes, yeah, 8 years.
The murders were 8 years apart. The mothers lived within 50 yards of each other.
Right.
Didn't really know each other that well, had a nodding acquaintance. And so there's an extraordinary moment when Steve's character has to go and, which he did himself. He took it on himself to do it, which was to go and inform the mother of the second victim, Becky Edwards, that they'd found her daughter. Realised that his driver was taking him. He thought the driver was taking him to the wrong address, but in fact it was no. It's the second mother lives just over there, and the first mother lives. And so that was extraordinary. They were joined together by the fact they both lost their daughters. They were physically close where they lived, geographically close. But then and they were both inspirational, amazing women in their own way, but very different characters. So I think Karen thought that they would have more of a relationship and be a rock to each other. But Elaine she didn't work that way. Her process was to go inwards, whereas Karen was to reach out, and she wasn't afraid to show her emotion, and she was a hugger. Elaine was not, and so it enabled me to, in the midst of everything else, to show how we grieve differently. And it was a really fascinating subplot, and Paul and I knew immediately the two actresses. It's funny that they just when we sat down to talk about it, and we talked about these two characters, we immediately knew the two actresses that we wanted to play the different mothers, and they in fact were we managed to, both of them said yes, and they were the actresses that played those parts. So it was that's what made it so multifaceted, is on top of everything that Steve was going through, and the whole thing about this black hole in the law that this case fell through, there was another whole side to it, which was, and there was an important message there, was there's no correct way to grieve. We react differently. And it was I can remember, exciting doesn't sound the right word, but it was. I can remember spending a lot of time with Elaine, and constantly trying in different ways to ask her why she didn't gel with Karen, and she kind of batted away questions, most of the questions, and then almost one of the last comments she made before I was working on that part of the script was she suddenly said, "Oh, it was too close," and then that, oh, okay, I now know, I understand that one line, I understood everything, and then as my process would be, okay, I know I'm building to that line, so then I, reverse engineered everything so that that line was the answer to the question.
And it's tricky because you don't want to create a dichotomy where one seems like the right way.
Exactly. No, sorry, I shouldn't. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, that's right. It wasn't that Elaine was in the wrong, Karen was in the right, Karen was in, or vice versa. They were both right, and they were both perfectly entitled to behave in the way they behaved. But that explained it.
Mm-hmm. And also just providing just enough backstory to know that these relationships are complicated, that the way that we grieve is different and complicated, but then also the people we're grieving and the relationships we're grieving can be unresolved. And that's just the reality of the tragic reality of the experience. I want to note that the actresses that we're talking about are Siobhan Finneran and Imelda Staunton, two incredible actresses.
Yeah, and the actual women, Karen and Elaine, both were incredibly frank with me. I mean, I'm discussing it now, I'm thinking of nearly never finding Steve. And then once I started to really put the story together, it needed both of those women to because if either of them had said, I really don't want this to happen, well, we wouldn't have done it, because there's no way you're going to make a story about someone who's lost a daughter who doesn't want that story to happen. But in their own way, I find this a lot, that the truth does actually, it is a catharsis. Steve found it cathartic. Both those mothers found it cathartic. And for their own reasons, they were very honest with me, brutally honest. I mean, Karen told me things about Becky. She didn't airbrush anything. She didn't flinch. Becky had a problem with drugs, and it ruined their lives. And she told me in agonizing detail how and what that meant.
Well, I mean, I think that says a lot about them, but we can imagine there being less safe or caring or meticulous hands to be put in than yours, Jeff's, or yours, Paul's, and obviously to begin with in terms of Stephen's. So I think that there's a lot of ways that a story like this couldn't quite be handled well or properly, and I think it's a testament that they trusted you as much as they did to tell this story. Thank you all for spending some time, particularly Paul on your birthday, to spend some time talking about
this. I would be sat in here on my own, watching TV and eating biscuits, so it's not like it's dragged me away from anything.